Welcome to this Airmic Hub session where we're going to talk about Protect Duty. Protect Duty is going to put in place legal requirements in relation to all areas where the public have access. The Arena inquiry arising out of the Manchester bombings concluded that doing nothing was not an option. The inquiry also concluded that whilst light touch may be okay for smaller venues, it won't be appropriate for bigger venues. And they say that whilst we see rigorous enforcement in relation to issues such as food hygiene, why shouldn't we have the same in place for matters of public safety? So that has clear implications for all Airmic members. And so we're going to take you through some of those issues that we've seen arising out of the Protect Duty and the anticipated legislation. I think first of all, it will be really helpful to cover why this has come about and how it's come about, and perhaps some of the findings of the Manchester inquiry. And I think Rose is the best person to deal with that.
Yeah, so 2017 was a particularly devastating year for the UK in terms of terrorist attacks. We saw attacks in Manchester and in London. And you quite often hear the Protect Duty referred to as Martin's Law. Now, Martin Hett was one of the tragic victims of the Manchester bombing, and his mother, Figan Murray, has been a major driving force in the development of the Protect Duty. And as you said, the Manchester Arena inquiry itself has focused heavily on counter-terrorism measures and what could be done to prevent these types of attacks in the future. And the chairman to the inquiry, Sir John Saunders, published his first report into the inquiry last year, which focused specifically on security arrangements, and he's made a number of recommendations in relation to Protect as well.
Alistair, could you talk us through the timetable for the consultation and implementation of Protect Duty?
Yeah, the Home Office consulted about the idea of introducing a duty, a Protect Duty, in 2021. Consultation closed in the summer. And the commitment to do so was actually part of the Conservative Manifesto of 2019, referencing Martin's Law, as Rose suggests. Then in January 2022, the Home Office released an analysis of the responses to the consultation, and there are nearly 3,000 of those, and there's a very strong thread of support for the duty, the introduction of a duty to take steps to not only assess the risk of a terrorist attack, but also appropriate measures to mitigate your vulnerability and stop it happening in the first place as best you can. And then very recently in the Queen's speech on the 10th of May, there's a reference to the introduction of a draft piece of legislation to give effect to the duty. So given that this Parliament is going to run for as long as spring 2024, before the next general election, it seems realistic to expect that we'd probably see a bill introduced perhaps in the second half of 2022, and that might take of the order of a year to go through. So I think my best guess would be that plus or minus 2 or 3 months at the end of 2023, the legislation could be in place and businesses will actively and legally be under a duty to assess terrorist risk and take steps to mitigate. I think the one thing I would add to that is that it's probably not very sensible to wait until the duty formally comes in to start looking at your risks here and your exposures. But the bill will really top it out and put that positive obligation on duty holders.
So Rose, I was thinking around the threshold for the application of the duty and who the duty applies to, because you think about many of the places that we all attend on a daily basis, that they can be shared spaces. So you'll have your owners, your occupiers, you'll have people managing those buildings, whether it's your facility services managers or your security companies. So, I suspect there could be many duty holders, but what is the position? Who is likely to hold that duty?
Yeah, absolutely. So the current proposal is that the duty will apply to any venue that's publicly accessible and has a capacity of at least 100 people, large organisations with 250 or more employees, and also public spaces. So that's really covering anything from small retail premises with only a handful of staff to, say, theme parks that are getting thousands of visitors per day. As you said, there's a real scope here for there to be confusion about who has responsibility if you're in an area that is shared by a number of parties. So one of the things that came out of the Manchester Arena inquiry was the fact that the area where the explosion occurred was a large publicly accessible location where there were a number of parties who had potential duties for security. So it'll be really important moving forward for any organisation that has a common space that's shared by others to really think about who is going to be responsible for security in that area.
And are we expecting to see some maybe excluded from the duty?
At the moment, rail, aviation and maritime are all excluded, but that's because they're covered by legislation elsewhere. There's also been some discourse about whether or not large events like Wimbledon might be excluded because, again, they have their own set of rules. But I think for the time being, it's the best course of action is just to assume that as long as you're meeting the threshold, you'll be captured by the legislation.
Where do you think the duty will fall in large office blocks where you've got a number of tenants, potentially large companies in London, for example? Would it fall on the landlord or potentially the employer?
I think for the time being, if you are a party that has any control over a particular space, whether that be as a tenant, a landlord, or some other kind of responsibility like a security organisation, then you have to assume that the duty is going to land on you. And unless you have a specific agreement between the parties, you'd have to discharge the duties by yourself, just to make sure that you're covering all of your bases. But as you say, it presents an interesting challenge because you often have big office spaces that are also publicly accessible because they have bars or cafes. And I think that's something that is yet to really be ironed out by the legislation. I
suppose you might end up with offices which are serviced offices or where you can just rent space out, which are a bit more retail-y, aren't they? So that they may end up holding the duty.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also get things like civic buildings where really they're workplaces, but you also get large numbers of members of the public that go in there as well.
And what's the main learnings, Rose, from a risk identification and risk assessment perspective following the Manchester attack?
So one of the things that came out of the Manchester Arena inquiry is that although there were risk assessments, they weren't considered to be adequate. So one of the key points of learning is to make sure that whenever the national terror threat level increases, you're reconsidering your risk assessments, and you're also keeping up to date with what the terror attack methodology is. So if we see a particular shift, to make sure that your risk assessments are lined up and you're capturing any potential new methodology.
So Jake, in preparation for the new law, what should Airmic members have on the board agenda in respect of Protect Duty?
So I think there's probably three things that the board should really be looking at. The first is understanding what needs to be applied in terms of resources to ensuring that they comply with the duty. Because I think like any new legislation, there's always a concern that you try to meet the requirements of the duty, but don't actually apply the resources that you might need to look after members of the public, look after staff, look after particular venues. So those two things might be different. So I think boards need to really accept that they may need to apply additional resource to achieve this effectively. I think the second thing is really looking at what is the risk appetite of the organisation with regard to adhering to protect duty, but also making sure that you are mitigating terrorism risk. So that also includes looking at things like risk transfer to the insurance market to say, okay, well, do we feel that we have appropriate insurances in place, and is that appropriate? Is that the right level that it should be? I think the third point is really looking at how board and senior leadership are getting involved in crisis management preparation after any potential terrorist incident might take place, because really that tone from the top is really important to make sure that all of these requirements are getting adhered to across the organisation.
Well, Jake, what's the reputational risk arising out of this for the board?
I think there's probably two answers to that question. The first is when you're looking at individuals, as directors and officers of an organisation, clearly it is their responsibility to make sure that the organisation adheres to this from a legislative perspective. I think the secondary consideration, though, reputationally, is if other organisations are adhering to Protect Duty, and hopefully we see a really significant improvement in controls for terrorism risk at publicly accessible venues, if an organisation is seen to not be really meeting that standard and meeting that threshold, you may reach a point where you have concerns around loss of attraction and members of the public or other stakeholders decide that actually that's affecting the reputation of the organisation.
And in terms of the threat, how has the threat environment changed over the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, clearly it's still a bit of a difficult one after COVID to figure out where it's going to go next. But what we've seen continuously is a more basic approach to terrorist groups carrying out attacks. So if you look at the trajectory over the last 20 years, we've moved from a situation where you would have fairly complex attacks utilising fairly complex tactics, fairly complex explosive devices, to a situation where you can carry out an attack with a knife or a set of knives. Now, I think from the point of view of protect duty, clearly the linchpin of all of this is carrying out a risk assessment. The most important thing about carrying out a risk assessment is that you are getting fed with intelligence that is telling you what those new tactics, techniques, and procedures are. And so from the point of view of what we think the threat's going to be in the future, it's always a very difficult question to answer. But I think what is very, very clear is that what we've seen is that the terrorism threat will continue to evolve. And as an organisation, if you're not taking account of that, any controls that you put in place as part of the duty will probably start to fall behind.
As an organisation, how do you keep up to date? How do you assess what the risk is at any given time?
Yeah, I think, the fantastic thing about the way that certainly the intelligence community in the UK or security services have evolved over the years, especially here, is they've made intelligence a lot more freely available than perhaps has historically been the case. So, if you can go onto resources like Protect UK, which is kind of jointly run by NATSO and a number of other parties, that will be able to give you some information about what the threat might look like and what intelligence is becoming available on what the security services think might happen in the future. Outside of that, clearly there are resources available in greater numbers than we've ever seen. But again, it's going through that risk assessment process where you're kind of collecting intelligence, you're making use of the information that is provided through things like Protect Duty or through other avenues to say, okay, what is it that we actually should be worrying about from a controls perspective?
And you go back to Alistair's point earlier on around the timeline. I mean, there's no duty at the moment. It's not law. Can businesses take any comfort from that?
Probably not. I think that the debate on the duty has been around for quite some time, even before the inquiry, but it really took off with the campaigning by Fegan Murray and the other relatives of those who were killed. And it's a serious prospect, and there will be legislation for the end of this Parliament. So I think of it as kind of a continuum. I don't think it'll be any comfort to business if they get caught short to say, oh, well, the duty wasn't formally in. I think you need to look at the risk, track the intelligence that Jake mentioned, and put in place a plan to proceed with the steps that are identified to minimise your vulnerability or transfer the risks away to the insurance market. And that needs to be audited and kept up to date. And I think the flip side of the duty, and one that's perhaps a little bit easier to forget, is that it will come with an enforcement regime. We don't quite know what that looks like, but I think there will be potentially remediation notices. There will be a range of criminal and or civil sanctions, which could be quite significant and could hit the business and hurt the business really hard if they don't comply. And there'll need to be ongoing monitoring. So I think maybe the best model to envisage, and this is not necessarily what will happen, but we think of the way the HSE protects individual and workforce risks to life. I think that's probably not a bad model to have in mind when we think about what enforcement of Protect might look like on an ongoing basis.
And would that apply the same sort of primary authority regime that we see a lot of businesses obviously have more than one location, numerous locations? So
yeah, there's no reason to think why it wouldn't. The detail hasn't been worked through, and I suspect on that and other sorts of details, we might see some consultation running in tandem with the legislation so that we can get through this quite quickly and get towards the end of 23 and have it in place. But yeah, there could well be a primary authority type approach.
Jake, how would Airmic members and businesses go about modelling the potential impact of a terrorist incident?
Yeah, so there's that old phrase that models aren't accurate, but they're always useful, right? I think that's the approach that especially large organisations should be taking to this. Really, we'd normally recommend starting with something like a tabletop exercise where you bring in the right stakeholders, you bring in external counsel in, you bring in even representatives from the emergency services to try to figure out what that exposure scenario might look like for an organisation in the event of a terrorist incident. What that gives you is pretty much a skeleton of what might happen and how that might affect the organisation. You know, what operations are affected, what stakeholders are affected, how is reputation brought into that. Once you have that skeleton of a scenario, you can start to sit down with, you know, the CFO, finance teams to actually start to put some monetary numbers to that from a business interruption perspective. Doing that and making that financial assessment is really, really important because it gives organizations a baseline to do a cost benefit analysis and say, okay, well, look, you know, we weren't necessarily, even with Protect Duty coming in, our board was reticent to apply resources to this particular problem. But then if you show them the impacts of a potential incident on the organisation from a financial perspective, you can start to assess what those returns on investment might be, which, you know, speaking frankly, is really where a lot of the change is going to come about. Because if we're talking about more significant protection measures, you know, those are going to cost money.
So is there a place there for, you know, see scenario testing, don't we, with policy wordings? Is that what you expect to see here?
I think so. I mean, I think it's definitely going to depend on the size of the organisation, of course. But I think organisations that are of a certain size and have a number of venues, I think really there is an impetus there that they really have to sit down as a senior management team. And if it's a kind of basic scenario assessment, I think that is going to be really important to figure out how that kind of organisation might meet Protect Duty, but might also try to exceed it.
So let's talk about the insurance implications. Following the Queen's speech, what should businesses be doing now?
So, you know, if we take that example of a kind of scenario-based assessment, you know, we'd be looking at that. There's been an evolution in the insurance market over the last 20 years to move away from, you know, response to terrorism incidents that are based on things like property damage triggers, right? We have to look at how the threat is evolving, and so the insurance industry can respond for policyholders in the right way. So I think from that perspective, what we're likely to see with Protect Duty is more of a focus on indemnification and more of a focus on liability, you know, rather than business interruption necessarily. And so if I was looking at this as an Airmic member, I would really be looking at, okay, well, where does my policy wording suggest that liability might sit? You know, would it come under a terrorism policy that's already there? Would it come under a general liability policy? Is it specifically excluded? Because I think that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out when we look at Protect Duty, is figure out how underwriting markets are going to respond to this, where those losses might come from. So we may end up seeing a case where, you know, existing terrorism wordings are expanded to cover new scenarios that we hadn't envisaged before. Equally, you may end up having completely standalone, you know, there are already standalone terrorism liability products that you can access. Those might become, you know, even more common than they are right now. So I think it's a bit of a moving target, but it's definitely one of those things that Airmic members should figure out where those policy wordings sit and to make sure nothing will fall through the gaps.
Rose, just listening to that, I suppose what you can expect to see out of this is if there is an incident and you may see claims. I mean, what's the threshold in relation to a claim under Protect Duty, or will you be able to bring a claim under Protect Duty? Is there a civil liability?
Well, I think there's a very strong likelihood that the legislation will bring about a direct cause of action for victims of terrorist attacks. And even if there isn't a statutory duty, it will help claimants in establishing negligence. But that being said, it's actually not a particularly new concept. So we know that travel agent TUI actually settled a large number of civil claims last year, which arose from the terrorist attacks in Tunisia in 2015. So I think it's very likely there'll be some kind of civil cause of action.
Rose, Jake, from a training perspective, what can businesses start doing now, and where, what areas should they really focus on?
I think a key area is going to be making sure that your staff know how to spot hostile behaviour and how they should report that, make sure that they feel empowered to report that to somebody in the business, and also what they should do if a terrorist attack occurs. And we know that was a major problem in the Manchester Arena inquiry, where members of staff had received a report from a member of the public that there was something suspicious, and for whatever reason failed to report that, and that had a really detrimental effect on what happened next. So you absolutely have to make sure that your staff know who they should be reporting any issues to. I think another thing that's going to come about from this is to make sure that people have some kind of mandatory first aid training that focuses on the types of injuries that you get from terrorist attacks, because they're so specific. And there's actually this fantastic publicly available app called Citizens Aid, and that was really created in recognition of the fact that most people who respond to terrorist attacks in the first instance are members of the public, so people that don't have the kind of training that emergency services do. And it'll teach you how to do things like tie a simple tourniquet or stop catastrophic bleeding. And those are really things that businesses should pick up on.
I think from a tactical perspective, one of the things that we very often see before any attack is a period of either short or prolonged reconnaissance. And so that's really an opportunity to make a difference. And it's, learning counter-surveillance type behaviours. I think the other thing that I would say is also making sure that other kind of contractors or other organisations within the venue's ecosystem are meeting that same level of training that Rose was describing. So you don't have gaps where you've deployed it to your own staff, but then you have subcontractors, whether it's cleaners or security, that haven't hit that same level. And so I think it's making sure that organisations understand they have a responsibility to ensure that it trickles down the supply chain as well.
Like, following on from that, cost is a big issue. The conversations that we're having is you hear businesses think, well, this is going to cost us a lot of money to implement this. Is there a tested proportionality as to what they have to do? And maybe I'll raise that to both of you again, actually, to Jake and to Rose.
There's definitely been recognition that there has to be some kind of proportionate approach, because small organisations just don't have the resources that larger ones do. So actually at the back of the Home Office's consultation report, there's a separate annex that sets out different businesses of different sizes and different functions and suggests the kind of things that they might want to implement. But there will be basic requirements that all organisations need to meet. So sort of the training that we've just discussed, some kind of risk assessment, and then as you build it up to larger organisations, those organisations might need some kind of physical security measures, so things like bollards to stop vehicle attacks, or the ability to shut down different parts of the premises in the event of attack. But there has very much been a recognition that there should be a proportionate approach, and that really takes into consideration the likelihood of an attack on a particular premises, the impact that might have, and the resources that organisation has to respond.
Yeah, just coming in on that, I think the detail of the material does talk about using that sort of well-known phrase from health and safety legislation, so far as is reasonably practicable. And I think that will be the nature of the duty. So that can flex then according to the size of the business and the size of the risk.
And I think just on that point as well, I think that actually when we do consulting with clients, the thing that we tend to find is actually the most effective controls are the ones that don't really cost a lot of money. It's more of a commitment of time and a commitment of thinking about it and communicating to staff in the right way. And I think the other thing is that actually we might end up seeing where you have more capital intensive controls, they reduce other types of claims. It might reduce crime, it might reduce other types of offending. So I think it's probably for organisations to look at it in the round when they're thinking of, or if they're worrying about the level of resource that might be required.
So Alistair, Rose, Jake, thank you very much for taking us through the Protect duty. I'm sure that's given our Airmic members a lot of food for thought in preparation for our workshop on the 7th of June. I'm sure they will come armed with plenty of questions on the day, and hopefully we'll get some questions in advance as well. So thank you again for your time and see you on the 7th of June.